Hi there, Mel here from Synthesis Health Lab, and today we are going to go through how your cells heal once they've been infected or injured or stressed in any way. They go through a process, and it's really helpful to understand what that process is and what the steps are so that you know how to heal, how to go through a process yourself, and to make sense of conflicting evidence, to really understand what not to do and what to do, and so on. So this is really exciting stuff, really great research that's come out. So I want you to understand it. So before we dive into what happens when a cell is stressed or injured, first let's take a look at what happens when a cell is healthy, what's supposed to happen. So in our body, we have about 68 trillion cells, give or take, and just under half of those are human cells. The other half are bacterial cells, also viral and fungal. So we have a lot of cells to orchestrate. But in terms of our mitochondria, which are conducting our immune response, we have over 100 quadrillion mitochondria. And just to put that into context, that's 1 million times as many stars as there are in the Milky Way. Now, normally when we look at mitochondria, we might see an image that looks something like this sort of bean-shaped organelle. But really, what's really helpful to understand is that in reality, mitochondria have different modes. And for those different modes, for those different activities that they need to perform, they have different shapes and they can shapeshift. And so on the left, you can see that the mitochondria are more connected in a network, like strands, right? So that they're touching each other and talking to each other and communicating with each other. And on the right, they are more separated. They are more distinct. They're more isolated. And this actually can be referred to as the spaghetti and meatballs configuration of mitochondria. So we don't want to think of them as a bean-shaped organelle. We want to think of them as something that is moving and dynamically responding to environmental signals. And so these environmental signals throughout the course of a day would be the sun being up versus the sun being down, light versus dark, warmth versus cold, and whether or not the cells are metabolically active or are they resting, are they fed or are they fasting. And so every single day when your cells are healthy, they are cycling through these different states relatively. So during the day, they tend to be a bit more autonomous and they're doing their thing relatively. And then at night, they are more connected and networked and sharing resources. And so the mitochondria are dynamically integrating all this information. So they've got these cues from the light photons, from heat, from the weather, whether or not there are infections or microbes, moisture levels, hydration levels, energy levels, which is really key, and also whether there are nutrients available, as well as temperature cues. And then they're taking all of this information in, and then from that they are dynamically adjusting, first of all, whether or not we are building up or breaking down our tissues. Also, whether we are making energy or using energy, whether we are storing it, and whether that energy is being used to fuel energetic processes like, running around or playing or whatever you want to do, or is that energy being used to fight infection? And whether or not that you can use that energy to think, to connect, to emote. So the mitochondria, when they are healthy, are following these daily and seasonal rhythms of light and dark, hot and cold, fasting and feeding, electromagnetic cycles that change throughout the day and the month and the year, as well as movement and rest, and use and repair. So the mitochondria integrate all this information and then dynamically change metabolism, they change their shape, they change their hormone output, they change energy availability, as well as crosstalk with the microbiome and the nervous system that's happening in real time. This is an interesting paper that's outlining this and looking at the mitochondria as the hub that is coordinating daily rhythms, metabolism, microbiome, and immunity. So if we are going to look at blood chemistry and if we're going to look at health through the microscopic lens, then it is really helpful to use a mitochondrial-centric approach, because really what they are doing is what determines what is going on in the biochemistry. And this is just a look at that here from the paper, that the mitochondria are taking all these signals of, whether there's a virus or a pathogen, what the microbiome are doing, what time of day it is, whether or not we've eaten, and so on. And then it's integrating that up and down the levels of organization. Healthy cells contain healthy mitochondria, which flexibly and dynamically adapt to daily and seasonal rhythms and cycles of light and dark, hot and cold, movement and rest, and caloric intake and fasting. And so this changes throughout the year. And what you can see is that during the summer, when we have more light and we have more warmth, the mitochondrial modes and metabolism are shifted up a little bit. And so the highest during the day is going to be a little bit higher than the highest during the winter. And likewise, it's shifted down a little bit for the winter. These numbers over here are telling us a bit about the polarization or the charge of the mitochondria throughout the year. So we have summer and winter metabolism that's different, right? And this sort of makes sense. We know this if we look at animals, that they have different metabolism in the summer and winter, and so do we. We also have morning and night metabolism, and the mitochondria can dynamically adapt its metabolism and shape based on timing and need. So going back here, if if the mitochondria are following this cycle, but suddenly you stub your toe, then it can change, or if the weather changes, it can change. So now that we've looked at what the mitochondria do and how they behave when they are healthy and all is well, now let's take a look at when there is a problem and when the alarm gets triggered. There's an increasing awareness of this concept of the exposome, and that's the total culmination of all of the things that we are exposed to throughout our lifetime. So this is taken from a recent paper, and it includes things like stress, lifestyle, air pollution, medications that people take, infections, xenobiotics, diet, and also our internal environment. And the interplay of all of those factors is playing into how much this alarm is getting triggered. So this is another way of looking at that same idea, that all of these different things can trigger the alarm. And I want to interject here and say that it's very rare for there just to be one thing and one really big problem in how people approach recovering from complex chronic health is that they are looking for a trigger. And if there were just only one trigger, then it'd be fairly simple to find it and address it. The reality is that for modern people, there are pretty much always multiple triggers. And so we need to take a more systems-based approach to becoming well and staying well. So we have our healthy cell cycle going throughout the day. And then what happens is now a trigger comes along. So that could be a virus, that could be a cut, that could be a dangerous situation, that could be a chemical, that could be, food full of additives. Whatever it is, it's something that requires the cell to expend energy in order to get back to a healthy baseline. And so that stressor triggers what is known as the healing cycle or the cell danger response. And so that stressor triggers what is known as the healing response or the cell danger response. And a key thing to understand here is that it doesn't matter what it is, it's non-specific, because our cells evolved billions of years ago, and they really have a limited repertoire of how they're going to respond. And so it kind of treats all stressors in a similar way. So now let's take a look at the cellular healing cycle, which is also known as the cell danger response. When a cell is stressed or injured, it goes through 3 distinct steps to heal, coordinated by the mitochondria. These 3 steps have distinct checkpoints and metabolism. They correspond to 3 distinct mitochondrial modes. Chronic illness occurs when enough cells are stuck and unable to complete the healing cycle. So if we look here, we have our healthy cell over here, and then we have a trigger, a stressor. It can be an environmental toxin or an infection. And then what happens is we end up with a stress cell, right? And so in order to heal, it has to go through 3 steps to become a healthy cell again. So these can be referred to as cell danger response 1, cell danger response 2, and cell danger response 3. And it's only when these 3 stages are complete that we end up with a healthy cell, or sometimes a cell that is stronger and healthier than before. So going back to how our cells behave when they're healthy and then what happens when they're triggered, now you can see that when a cell is stressed, it leaves this health cycle of following the daily rhythms, and it kind of comes out of that for a while until it can go through the stages of healing and then rejoin the cycle. So healing step 1, or cell danger response 1, is all about defense and containment. So mitochondria and cells will become more autonomous and they will drop off the network. And this is intentional in order to protect the rest of the system. So this involves an activation of the innate immune system, that fast, primitive immune system. The cell drops off the network and becomes more autonomous. Once the cell has handled that threat satisfactorily, so it's brought in enough defenses and it's used its energy to neutralize the threat, it can then enter cell danger response 2 or healing step 2. And this is about growth and repair, replacing injured tissue, and it switches to something called a Warburg metabolism, which is a particular type of way of making energy, but that's most efficient for cells that are growing and rapidly dividing. And this stage of the immune response is associated with the biochemistry of the adaptive immune system in a more kind of specific longer-term response. Once any damaged tissue has been adequately replaced and signaling is in place, then cells can shift into cell danger response 3 or the third healing step. And at this stage, they're shifting back into a healthy, normal metabolism. They're rejoining the network of the body, and they are learning to be specialized in specific tissues and organs. So they're learning to be, a liver cell if that's what was replaced, or a skin cell, and so on. And this is actually achieved through calcium waves of resonance. So the way it gets that information of knowing, it's a little bit like doing the Mexican wave, that it starts doing that wave and then it knows how to behave in this network. And it's also an aspect of the memory immune system, because its three-dimensional structure is now going to be different than it was before, and it's going to carry on the experience of the infection or the injury so they can better respond next time. So if we look at how our cells evolved and then how we evolved, we can see that the cell danger response corresponds to these different stages of evolution, which is really kind of similar to how each of us develops from a single-celled fertilized egg all the way through embryo and infant and so on. So when a cell enters the cell danger response, it becomes more like an individual anaerobic cell that's not using oxygen. And then when it progresses, it becomes more like a rapidly proliferating colony of cells. Then it gets more of this sort of organ systems identity. And finally, health is achieved when the cell then reconnects to the network and then can reestablish that control from the central person, from the nervous system, from the brain, the heart, and that central top-down control. Now, this slide was created from some of Bob Naviaux's work, and it's a little bit complex, but it's really worth spending a little bit of time, because again, I feel like this can clear up so much confusion about different things that get recommended, like that everyone should be strengthening their vagus nerve, or everybody should be focusing on the microbiome. And really, we are an integrated network. We need to understand how these things are working together, and also understand that these stages, involve intentional adaptations. So, for example, when a cell enters the cell danger response, and if there's an infection, we intentionally reduce our vagus nerve output. So the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body, and it's giving us that parasympathetic, rest and digest nervous system, which is really great if we're not under attack, if we're not under threat, and we don't have an infection. But if we do have an infection, then we don't want to be in that physiology. And so we need to have a signal that tells the vagus nerve to reduce its output so that we can mount a response to the stress. So there is a place, for example, for strengthening the vagus nerve, but it's really once we get over here where the threat's been neutralized. So for example, if you have a chronic infection, then maybe strengthening your vagus nerve isn't the right thing to do right now, if that makes sense. Same thing with the microbiome. There's research showing that when people have an acute septic shock and they go, if they're in the hospital, that automatically changes the microbiome. The microbiome automatically, dynamically adjusts. It's not a simple matter of taking probiotics or, eating sauerkraut. And here, and this is a really interesting thing to understand as well, that ATP is the main energy of our body. And when there's a stressor, or when there's a trigger, that what the most basic signal that happens, and this happens in single-celled organisms that are billions of years old, the energy inside of the mitochondria, inside of the cell, goes outside of the cell. And that makes sense. If you were to cut a cell, the energy would leak out. But this is used as an organizing signal for the body to know where to put its resources. So what you can see is that the extracellular ATP, that's what E stands for, it goes up, and then throughout healing, it goes down. And then when it comes down here, we're now back to health. So, there's so many different things that are being kind of recommended and sold for increasing your energy. But if you have a chronic infection or mycotoxins or stress or Lyme or all of those things, if you increase your energy and your cells are leaking, it's just going to be spilling out like battery acid, right? We need the battery acid inside of the battery so we can have energy. But if there's holes and it's leaking out, then we might not want to increase that battery acid, right? So we really need to have a better understanding of what's going on if we're going to intervene intelligently, and if you're going to be able to follow a systematic approach that's going to really help you. Up here, these are actually just the terms of the different modes that the mitochondria have that you might see in research. So M2 tend to be called anti-inflammatory or healthy modes, and that's the health mode. M1 is when we are triggering that strong first immune response, right? So all of your inflammation, there's different words that you might have heard, nuclear factor kappa beta and NLP3 inflammasome, all of those things are associated here with this trigger. Then M0 is your cells that are naive. They're the stem cells that are coming out to replace the biomass. It's also the type of cell that when we're growing, when we're an infant or when we're a child, that when we're growing new tissue, we're using that mode, and then finally become back to that healthy mode. Also interesting, you can see, is that we reduce our oxygen consumption as we go through this process, right? And so if we're using things like breathing exercises, we really need to tailor them to the stage that we're at, because it's intentional on the part of your system to reduce its oxygen consumption so that it can go through these stages. So if we look at our levels of organization, so how our body is made from smaller building blocks that make bigger building blocks and so on, and that we have these different levels of organization that are happening at the same time. What we want to understand, and what we could see on the previous slide, is that the cell danger response is about coordinating the response to something like, a virus. A virus is tiny, right? So how is it that you, a giant person made of 70 trillion cells, actually even know about it? It's the coordination between these levels, and that's one of the things that the mitochondria do back and forth with our nervous system and our immune system and our endocrine system. Now, there's a concept I hear a lot that I think is really based on a misunderstanding of how the immune system works. A lot of people are trying to achieve immune balance, and a lot of practitioners are trying to help you to achieve immune balance. And this is based on this idea that the immune system is like a seesaw, and all you have to do is push down the end that's too high, and using a drug or using supplements or using herbs, and then you'll be healthy. But really, as you know now, the immune system works on a cycle, not like a seesaw. So the immune system is not a seesaw. Healing happens in a 3-step cycle. And so this is a diagram from a recently published paper, but you can see this in loads of different papers, giving this idea that the immune system either goes up or down, that you can push on different sides of it. And really, again, this is based on a misunderstanding that once we begin that healing cycle, we need to complete it. Now, this is a representation of that from one of Bob Naviaux's seminal works looking at this, and we can see that cells go through these cycles as they get damaged or infected and they heal, and that also that as we get older, we can accumulate mosaics of cells that are at incomplete stages of the healing cycle. So one thing I want to point out is that people in general, they don't tend to have only cells that are stuck in one stage. It really is a combination, but the most predominant one is going to be the one that maybe influences what disease someone has. So if we look at this hypothetical 90-year-old person here, they really look like they have a lot of cells that are stuck at cell danger response 2, and that would be associated with things like cancer and obesity and type 2 diabetes. So they, in our society, they would be in good company, but this could look different depending on the individual. So you can't unscramble an egg, and you can't go backwards on the healing cycle, right? You have to go forwards. The path to health does not retrace the steps of the path to disease. And pretty much any medication in existence is really trying to stop the effects of the healing cycle rather than help remove the barriers to moving through towards healing. But we really need to remove these triggers, and we need to remove these blockages to the progression of the healing response. And when we think about our biochemistry, if we want to understand really what these patterns are showing us and what it really means, it corresponds to the health and healing cycles. This is partly why there's so much conflicting advice out there, because people focus on one marker or another marker or a certain type of pattern, and really it just depends on where people are at in their healing. So when you hear blanket advice about supplements or about ways to boost your immune system or ways to improve your metabolism, now you can really understand why these don't work for everyone and why they do work for a lot of people. So, really common group of illnesses are from these CDR2 illnesses. These are illnesses that come from too many calories, too much sugar, basically too much summer metabolism. And so there are tons of blogs and health books and all of those things giving advice on how on how to approach cell danger response 2. But if you are not there, then these can actually make you sick. So the cell danger response really represents a unifying theory of chronic disease, and especially if we can take all the wonderful genetic and metabolomics research that Bob Naviaux and his team have performed and have brought together and integrate that with really comprehensive maps of how the body communicates at a three-dimensional level that we have from Chinese medicine and models like that, then we can really have a unifying theory of what chronic disease is and how we can improve it. So Bob Naviaux writes in one of his recent papers, once an injury occurs, active progress through the stages of healing is driven by sequential changes in cellular bioenergetics and the disposition of oxygen and carbon skeletons used for fuel signaling, defense, repair, and recovery. Over 100 chronic illnesses can be organized into 3 persistent stages of the CDR. And this is totally consistent with my background in Chinese medicine and how we look at patterns, that we have more than 3 patterns, but we can really start to overlay these and really be able to see why people with such a wide variety of chronic issues can get better from similar processes that I take people through. Being stuck in cell danger response 1 is associated with things like allergies, histamine, chronic innate immune activation, mast cell activation, hives, that sort of thing. Being stuck in cell danger response 2 predominantly is associated with things like metabolic syndrome, diabetes, cancer, obesity, things that involve too much growth, right? And being stuck predominantly in cell danger response 3, not being able to exit it and go into the health cycle, is associated with many developmental disorders such as autism and many psychological issues, including PTSD, as well as many autoimmune issues. It's also associated with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. I mean, this is fascinating. Really, the physiology of chronic fatigue syndrome actually looks almost identical in many ways to many representations of autism. So what we really want to understand is that inflammation is not one thing. It's a series of orchestrated steps designed to heal us. And so when we talk about the immune system, we really want to think more globally about the system that heals us. And we want to be really careful if we're going to try to block it or boost it or go in and tinker with it in any way. And I think that really the more wise approach is to try to go through a systematic process where we can remove triggers and then systematically go through and identify and remove blockages to allowing it to complete, because really, given the opportunity, it knows exactly how to do that. So that's an overview of the cell danger response and how healing happens at the cellular and mitochondrial level, and how that information gets communicated up to the brain, to you as an organism. And hopefully this starts to make clear why so much advice that you've had or things that you've tried in the past seem to be conflicting and they don't make sense, and really supports the idea that that it's much more helpful to go through a systematic whole systems thinking process where you can systematically remove the blockages to healing and then get better. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the lab.